They lied to you. Every priest who ever promised you eternal paradise. Every scribe who took your gold to write protective spells on your tomb walls. Every embalmer who swore their mummification would preserve you forever. They told you that death was simply a doorway, that if you lived righteously and knew the proper words, you would pass through the underworld and emerge into a paradise of endless bounty. They described the field of reeds in perfect detail, the golden crops, the clear waters, the reunions with loved ones. What they didn't tell you is this: most souls never make it there. Your heart stops beating. Your lungs draw their final breath. Your eyes close, and in that instant between life and death, you make a discovery that changes everything you thought you knew about the afterlife. The journey ahead isn't just difficult, it's designed to filter out the unworthy with ruthless efficiency. The demons aren't there to frighten you. The gates aren't there to slow you down. Every challenge, every test, every terrifying creature that waits in the darkness serves one purpose: to ensure that only those who truly deserve immortality will achieve it. And here's what no one told you during your life, what the priests themselves may not have fully understood. Your body is being prepared for a journey. Yes, but you, the conscious you, the soul that just separated from flesh, you're already standing at the threshold of the Duat. The familiar world of Egypt, with its sun-warmed stones and the rhythmic flow of the Nile, has fallen away like a dream at waking. Before you stretches a landscape that shouldn't exist, that defies every law of nature you ever knew, where rivers run with substances that aren't quite water and aren't quite fire, where the sky itself watches you with hostile intent. Behind you, in the world you've left, your family is beginning the rituals. They're washing your body, preparing it for the 70 days of mummification that will transform it from corpse to sacred vessel. They're weeping, yes, but they're also calculating. How much can they afford to spend on your burial? Which spells are essential? Which can be omitted? Will a simple wooden coffin suffice, or will they commission the nested sarcophagi that cost as much as a house? Every decision they make right now, in their grief and their pragmatism, will determine whether you survive the next 12 hours. Because that's how long you have. 12 hours, the 12 hours of night, when Ra, the sun god, makes his perilous journey through the Duat, battling the forces of chaos so that dawn can come again. You'll be making that same journey through the same 12 regions, facing the same dangers. But unlike Ra, who travels in a divine bark surrounded by protective gods, you're walking alone, in the dark, with nothing but the spells you memorized and the hope that your heart weighs less than a feather. But here's the first twist in a journey full of them. You're not even entirely sure what you means anymore. In life, you were one unified being, body, mind, personality, memories, all seamlessly integrated into a single self. Now, in death, you're discovering that you were never one thing at all. You're fragmenting into 9 separate parts, each with its own nature and destination, each requiring its own preservation and care. Your car, your vital life force, is already pulling away, hovering near your corpse, confused about where to go. Your bar, depicted in tomb paintings as a human-headed bird, is flexing wings you didn't know you had, preparing to fly between the worlds of the living and dead. Your ib, your heart, the repository of every deed and every sin, lies waiting in your chest for the moment it will be removed and weighed. The ancient Egyptians did not fear death the way many cultures do. They feared something far worse, the second death, the final obliteration, the consumption of the heart by a creature whose very existence was designed to enforce cosmic justice. They feared failing the test, being found unworthy, ceasing to exist not gradually, but absolutely, erased from reality as if you had never been born. This is not a story about monsters and magic, though there are both in abundance. This is not a tale of gods playing with mortal fates, though the gods are everywhere present. This is something more unsettling, a window into what a civilization truly believed happened after death. And what makes it fascinating, what makes it frightening, is how specific they were. The Egyptians didn't offer vague promises of heaven. They gave you maps. They named the demons. They told you which gates opened with which words, which judges would examine which sins, what exact weight your heart needed to be to pass through to paradise. They spent 3,000 years refining this system, this elaborate machinery of death and resurrection, until every detail was mapped and every possibility accounted for. Kings and farmers, priests and potters, scribes and servants, everyone who ever lived in ancient Egypt knew exactly what would happen after they died. The path through the Duat, the names to speak, the spells to recite. The moment when everything you ever were would be measured on golden scales against a single feather. Tonight, we will follow that path together. We will trace the journey of a soul from the moment of death through the 12 regions of the Duat, each one more dangerous than the last. We will stand before the 42 divine judges who know every sin you've ever committed. We will watch as Anubis, the jackal-headed god, places your heart on the scales while Ammit the Devourer waits with jaws already open. We will learn what happens if the scales balance, and what horror unfolds if they don't. But we'll also discover something the priests didn't emphasize, something that gets lost in translations and modern retellings. This journey was designed to be passable. It was difficult, yes, terrifying, absolutely, but it was meant to be completed by ordinary people who lived decent lives. This wasn't a test reserved for heroes or saints. This was the destiny every Egyptian hoped to fulfill, pharaoh and farmer alike. The democratization of the afterlife is one of ancient Egypt's most revolutionary contributions to human religious thought. In the beginning, only kings could hope for eternal life. Only royal souls could join the gods in paradise. But over centuries, that exclusivity crumbled. By the New Kingdom, the Book of the Dead was available to anyone who could afford it, and even poorer versions, abbreviated scrolls with just the essential spells, brought some hope to those of modest means. The afterlife had become, in principle if not always in practice, accessible to all who lived according to Ma'at, the cosmic principle of truth, order, and justice. So let your breathing slow. Let the world around you fade. Imagine yourself not in the 21st century, but standing at the moment of death, feeling your car separate from your cut, watching your bar test its new wings, knowing that ahead lies a journey through darkness toward a paradise that seems impossible, but that millions before you claimed to have reached. The journey begins now, and it begins as all journeys into death must begin, with understanding something that will surprise you. You are not one soul, but 9. And each of those 9 parts has a different fate, a different role to play, a different kind of immortality to achieve, or to lose forever. The 9 parts of the soul, the truth about what you really are. To understand the Egyptian afterlife, you must first understand what the Egyptians believed you are, or rather, what you were made of. Not just your body, but the intricate spiritual machinery that animated it. And here's something that might surprise you. Even the Egyptians themselves didn't always agree on the details. The concept of the soul evolved over Egypt's 3,000-year history. In some eras, texts reference 5 parts of the soul, in others, 7. By the New Kingdom period, the number had grown to 9, suggesting that as Egyptian theology became more sophisticated, their understanding of human nature grew more complex, more nuanced, more reflective of the genuine mystery of consciousness and identity. Scholars examining ancient funerary texts note these variations, these shifts in understanding that occurred as dynasties rose and fell. What remained constant, though, was the core insight. You are not one thing, but many things. Not a single unified self, but a collection of separate, yet interconnected elements. Each requires its own care, its own preservation, its own path through the afterlife. The 9-part model most commonly referenced includes Kat, Ka, Ba, Ib, Ren, Shuyet, Ak, Sahu, and Sekhem. 8 of these are immortal or semi-divine, capable of surviving physical death. The 9th, the Kat, your physical body, is mortal, but paradoxically, it's essential to the survival of all the others. This explains why mummification became so central to Egyptian culture. They weren't just preserving a corpse. They were maintaining the anchor that kept the entire spiritual system from dissolving into nothingness. The first and most obvious part was the Kat, the physical body itself. This was the vessel, the container, the tangible form that everyone could see and touch. While living, the Kat housed all the other elements of the soul. After death, it became the anchor, the home base to which the other parts would return. This is why preservation of the body through mummification became so critical. The Kat was not discarded as unimportant, quite the opposite. Without the physical body, carefully preserved and protected in the tomb, the other elements of the soul would have nowhere to go, no way to exist. They would become unmoored, lost, unable to continue the journey toward eternal life. The Ka was perhaps the most important element, the life force itself, the vital essence that made you alive. Imagine it as an exact duplicate of yourself, created at the moment of your birth by the god Khnum on his potter's wheel. The Ka contained your personality, your characteristics, the spark that made you distinctly you rather than someone else. It was often depicted in art as a person with 2 upraised arms forming an embrace, symbolizing the Ka's protective and sustaining nature. The Ka needed sustenance, food, drink, offerings, which is why families left these things at tombs. They weren't being symbolic or metaphorical. They genuinely believed the Ka would consume the essence of these offerings, drawing nourishment from them, even though the physical objects remained untouched. The Ba was the personality, the soul in the sense we might understand it, the part of you that made you unique. It was depicted as a human-headed bird, and this imagery was precise. Like a bird, the Ba could fly, could move freely, could travel between the world of the living and the world of the dead. During the day, the Ba would leave the tomb, soaring through the air, visiting the places and people the deceased had loved in life. But every night, the Ba had to return to the body, to reunite with the Ka, so that both could receive sustenance and continue existing. This nightly reunion was essential. Without it, the soul would dissipate, would cease to be. The Ib was the heart, but not as a mere pump for blood. The Egyptians believed the heart was the seat of intelligence, emotion, memory, and will. The heart recorded everything you ever did, every choice you made, every kindness offered or refused. It was, in essence, the book of your life, and it could not lie. This is why the heart was not removed during mummification like the other organs. It had to remain in the body, carefully protected, because you would need it at the judgment. And this is also why the Egyptians placed heart, scarabs, special amulets inscribed with spells, over the heart of the deceased. These scarabs contained spell 30b from the Book of the Dead, which commanded the heart not to testify against its owner during the weighing ceremony. The heart knew all your sins, all your failures, and if it chose to reveal them, you would fail the test. The Ach was the transformed, glorified spirit that you could become if you passed through death successfully. It was not something you possessed in life, but something you achieved after death. A magical union of the Ka and Ba that occurred if you were judged worthy. The Ach was luminous, powerful, associated with light and the stars. It was the final form of your immortal self, the you that would live forever among the gods. To become an Ach was the ultimate goal, the reward for a virtuous life and successful navigation of all the tests and trials of the Duat. The Sahu was another aspect of the Ach, the spiritual body that appeared after judgment. While the Ka and Ba needed the physical body, the Sahu was incorporeal, a form made of light and divine essence. It could appear to the living in dreams, could protect or punish depending on how you had been treated in life. There are Egyptian letters from grieving widowers pleading with their wives Sahu to stop haunting them, to release them from guilt, to let them move on. The Sekhem was the life energy, the power of the soul. Not much detail survives about the Sekhem, but it seems to have been connected to vitality and presence, the force that animated all the other parts. The Book of the Dead describes it as a power that resides in the underworld with the gods Horus and Osiris. The Ren was your name, your true name, the word or words that defined your identity. Names had power in Egypt. To know someone's true name was to have power over them. To erase someone's name was to destroy them utterly, which is why enemies would chisel names off monuments and why parents kept their children's real names secret, using only nicknames in public. The Ren had to be preserved, had to be spoken, had to be remembered. As long as someone spoke your name, as long as it appeared on your tomb or in offerings, you continued to exist. This is why Egyptian tombs are covered with names, repeated over and over, carved deep into stone that would last millennia. They were ensuring eternal life through eternal memory. The Shuyet was your shadow, and though this might seem the least important element, it was taken very seriously. The shadow was a protective entity, a guide that would accompany you through the afterlife. Spells in the Book of the Dead speak of ensuring the shadow is not defeated, not separated from the soul. The shadow represented comfort and protection. Think of resting in the shade on a hot Egyptian day, and this quality extended into the afterlife journey. All 9 of these elements had to function together, had to be cared for and maintained, for you to achieve immortality. This is why Egyptian funerary preparations were so elaborate, why the rituals were so complex, why so much effort went into preserving the body, providing offerings, inscribing names, and equipping the tomb with everything the deceased might need. You were not preserving one thing, but 9 things. Not preparing for one journey, but for a multifaceted transition that involved every aspect of who you were. And when death came, when your heart stopped and your breath ceased, these 9 parts began to separate. The body remained, carefully mummified and entombed. The car lingered near the body in the tomb, sustained by offerings. The Ba prepared to fly, to begin its journey through the Duat. The heart waited in your chest for the moment it would be removed and placed upon the scales. Your name remained carved in stone. Your shadow stretched out before you as you stood at the threshold between life and death. This was who you were. This was what had to survive. And survival was not guaranteed. It required knowledge, preparation, magic, and above all, truth. Because you were about to enter a realm where nothing was what it seemed, where every step held danger, where demons waited with knives and lakes blazed with fire, and only those who knew the secret words, the hidden names, the powerful spells could hope to navigate the path to paradise. The journey through the Duat was about to begin, and your first guide had just arrived, a figure with the head of a jackal and the body of a man, carrying the Ankh that symbolized eternal life, coming to lead you into the darkness that lay beyond death. The moment of death and the arrival of Anubis, the precise moment of death, according to ancient Egyptian belief, was not a sudden severing, but a gradual transition, a process rather than an event. Your family and friends would have been watching, waiting, performing the rituals they had practiced and prepared for. They would have seen your chest stop rising. They would have heard the final rattling breath. They would have touched your skin as it began to cool. And in that moment, they would have begun the work that would allow you to come to existing. But you, the consciousness that had inhabited that body, the collection of soul elements that made you who you were, you experienced something entirely different. The Egyptians believed that as the body failed, the ka separated first, pulling away from the flesh like a mirror image stepping out of the mirror. The ba, that human-headed bird, would feel its freedom, would sense the ability to move beyond the physical constraints that had bound it to the body during life. The shadow would stretch and deepen, becoming more than just an absence of light, but a presence, a force, a guide. And then, there in the room where you had died, or in the mysterious space between worlds, a figure would appear. Anubis, the jackal-headed god, patron of embalmers, guardian of tombs, and most importantly, Psychopomp, the guide of souls through the land of the dead. Anubis did not appear terrible or frightening, though his jackal head might give pause. He appeared calm, professional, purposeful. This was his job, had been his job for thousands of years, would be his job for thousands more. He had guided countless millions through this transition, and he would guide you now. The ancient Egyptians chose the jackal as his sacred animal because jackals were seen in cemeteries, scavenging among the tombs, and they reasoned that an animal so familiar with death must serve as a link between the living and the dead. In artistic depictions, Anubis often carries the Ankh, the hieroglyph meaning life, in one hand and the Waz scepter, symbolizing power and dominion, in the other. His fur is black, the color of the rich Nile silt, the color of fertility and rebirth, the color of the fertile land that emerged after the inundation. Black also symbolized the color of the resins used in mummification, linking Anubis directly to the preservation process. He wears a golden collar, sometimes a white kilt, and moves with the grace and sureness of one who knows every path through the underworld, every danger, every shortcut, every gate. Anubis would speak to you, though the exact words were not recorded in surviving texts. Perhaps he offered reassurance. Perhaps he simply instructed you on what would come next. But his presence meant that you were no longer alone, that you had a guide for the journey ahead. He would not accompany you every step of the way. There were portions of the journey you would have to navigate yourself, but he would be there at the crucial moments, especially at the weighing of the heart when his role would become paramount. For now, though, Anubis's task was to escort you to the entrance of the Duat. This entrance was reached, the Egyptians believed, by traveling through your own tomb. The tomb was not just a storage place for your body and possessions. It was a threshold, a doorway, a liminal space that existed between the land of the living and the land of the dead. This is why tombs were so carefully oriented, why false doors were painted on their walls, why the architecture reflected passages and chambers leading deeper and deeper into the earth. They were not symbolic representations of a journey. They were the actual beginning of the journey itself. Anubis would lead you through the darkness of your tomb, past the offerings left for your car, past the Shabti figures that would serve you in the afterlife, past the texts inscribed on the walls, texts you would need, spells you would have to remember, names you would need to speak. Even if you could not read in life, your Ba would understand these hieroglyphs now. Death granted certain knowledge, certain abilities. You could read the sacred texts. You could speak the words of power. You could see and hear things impossible in mortal life. And then, at the western edge of your tomb, west, always west, where the sun set and died each night before being reborn each morning, you would find the entrance to the Duat proper. Some texts describe it as a doorway, some as a cleft in the earth, some as a descent through water. The exact form seemed to vary, perhaps because the Duat itself was not a fixed place, but a realm of transformation and change, a space that adapted to each soul's journey. What is consistent across all accounts is what you would feel as you crossed that threshold: a coldness, a darkness, a sense of vast space opening up around you. The familiar world, the sunlit land of Egypt with its fields and its river and its warm, dry air, would fall away. You would enter a place where normal rules did not apply, where the landscape itself was alien and hostile, where time moved differently if it moved at all. The Duat was not simply underground, though the Egyptians sometimes called it that. It was not simply a physical place you could reach by digging deep enough. It was the underworld in the truest sense. Under the world, beneath reality, existing in a space between spaces. When Ra, the sun god, set each evening, he entered the Duat from the western horizon and traveled through its 12 regions during the 12 hours of night, battling demons and chaos serpents, dying and being reborn before emerging at dawn in the east. The dead were believed to join this journey, to sail with Ra on his solar bark, or to undertake their own parallel journey through the same dangerous realm. Anubis would turn to you now, there at the threshold, and though no text records his exact words, we can imagine what he might say. The journey ahead is perilous. You will face challenges that will test not just your courage, but your knowledge, your virtue, the very essence of who you were and who you hope to become. Remember the spells. Speak the names. Do not deviate from the path. And above all, guard your heart, for it will bear witness to everything you have done, every choice you made, every truth you spoke or failed to speak. At the end of this journey, if you are worthy, paradise awaits. But between here and there lies the Duat. And the Duat is not kind to the unprepared or the unjust. With those words, or something like them, Anubis would step aside, and you would enter. You would take your first steps into the land of the dead, into the realm of Osiris, into the 12 regions that Ra traverses each night, into the geography of the afterlife that ancient Egyptians mapped with extraordinary precision and terrifying detail. What you would see as you descended into the Duat is what we must now describe. A landscape of rivers and deserts, caverns and gates, lakes of fire and fields of knives, populated by gods and demons, monsters and guardians, all waiting to challenge you, to test you, to determine if you were worthy of continuing the journey toward immortality. The darkness would close around you. The air would change, and somewhere in the distance you would hear the first sounds of the underworld, the rushing of waters that were not water, the screaming of souls who had failed their tests, the chanting of spells, the opening and closing of gates, the eternal battle between order and chaos, that played out night after night in the realm between death and rebirth. Your journey through the Duat had truly begun. The geography of the Duat. Mapping the underworld. To modern minds, the idea of mapping the afterlife seems strange, even contradictory. How can you chart something that doesn't physically exist? But the ancient Egyptians did exactly that, creating detailed accounts of the Duat's geography with the precision of cartographers and the vision of poets. The underworld was not vague or undefined in their belief system. It had specific regions, distinct zones, particular features that you needed to know and recognize. Getting lost in the Duat was not a metaphor. It was a real danger that could leave you wandering forever, unable to find paradise, unable to complete your transformation into an ark. The most comprehensive maps of the Duat come from texts called the Duat, meaning that which is in the afterworld. These were found carved into the walls of royal tombs, particularly during the New Kingdom period, and they described the sun god Ra's nightly journey through the underworld in extraordinary detail. Since the dead were believed to follow a similar path, or to join Ra on his journey, these texts served as both theological documents and practical guidebooks. The Duat was divided into 12 regions, corresponding to the 12 hours of night. Each hour, each region, had its own character, its own challenges, its own population of deities and demons. The journey began when you entered from the west, following the setting sun, and progressed eastward through the night, toward rebirth at dawn. The first hour was a transitional zone, a region where the last light of day still lingered at the edges. This was the entrance hall of the underworld, where the recently dead first arrived and where Ra's solar bark first began its descent. The texts describe it as having a cavern where the sun god's crew would invoke protective spells and prepare for the journey ahead. For the newly deceased soul, this first region was relatively safe, a place to orient yourself, to remember the spells you had learned, to steel yourself for what lay ahead. But even here, there were guardians who challenged you, who demanded to know your name and your purpose, who would turn you away or destroy you if you could not answer correctly. The second hour brought you deeper into darkness. The waters here were described as the waters of Ra, a primordial river that flowed through the underworld, but this was not the friendly Nile. This was dark water, cold water, water that could drown the soul as easily as the body. Along the banks of this river stood deities who received prayers from the living world on behalf of the dead. If your family had performed the proper rituals, if offerings had been made, these gods would recognize you and allow you to pass. If not, you might be turned back, forced to wander until someone remembered to speak your name and make the necessary offerings. The third hour was called the region of Osiris, and here the waters of Ra transformed into the waters of Osiris. This was significant. Osiris was the lord of the underworld, the first being to die and be resurrected, the king of the dead and the judge of souls. His presence in this region indicated that you were now truly in his realm, subject to his laws, approaching the place where he would ultimately determine your fate. The texts describe agricultural imagery in this region, fields, crops, the tools of farming, because Osiris was also associated with vegetation and renewal. The Egyptians believed the Nile itself originated from the underworld, that its life-giving waters flowed from the realm of Osiris. So this region, despite being underground and in darkness, was paradoxically a place of fertility and potential rebirth. The fourth hour brought you to the most dangerous region yet encountered, the desert of Sokar, the hawk-headed god of the necropolis. This was a barren wasteland devoid of water, impossibly hot despite being underground, a place where nothing grew and nothing lived. Even Ra's boat could not navigate here. There was no water to float on, no path to follow. Instead, the sun god had to be transformed, had to travel in a different form, had to rely on his voice rather than his sight to find the way through the darkness. For the deceased soul, this region represented the lowest point of the journey, the moment of greatest despair, the place where hope seemed most distant. If you could traverse this desert, if you could survive this hour, you had proven your resilience, your determination, your worthiness to continue. The fifth hour showed the first signs of transformation and renewal. Here the texts describe Ra beginning to prepare for his eventual rebirth. The darkness was still profound, but there were hints of the dawn that would eventually come. The deceased who reached this region knew they had passed the deepest, most dangerous point of the Duat, and were now on the ascending path toward judgment and, if worthy, toward paradise. The sixth hour was called the Hour of the Abode of Osiris, and it was here that the Hall of Truth was located, the place where judgment would occur, where hearts would be weighed, where Osiris sat on his throne to determine who would be admitted to eternal life and who would be cast into oblivion. We will explore this hall in great detail in a later section, but for now, understand that reaching the sixth hour meant reaching the moment of ultimate trial. Everything you had done in life, every choice you had made, every truth you had spoken or lie you had told would be revealed and judged. The 7th through 11th hours represented the journey after judgment, assuming you had passed the test. These regions were filled with hostile forces that tried to prevent even justified souls from reaching paradise. There were serpents to be defeated, gates to be opened with secret words, demons to be appeased or overcome. The sun god Ra battled Apophis, the chaos serpent, during these hours. A cosmic battle between order and chaos, between existence and non-existence, between light and darkness. The deceased soul participated in this battle, fought alongside Ra and the other gods, proved that they were worthy not just of paradise, but of joining the divine company, of becoming something more than human. The 12th hour brought the final transformation and rebirth. This was the hour of dawn, the moment when Ra was reborn as Khepri, the scarab beetle, pushing the sun disk above the eastern horizon. The dead who had successfully completed the journey were also reborn, transformed into their ark form, ready to either enter the field of reeds or to continue sailing with Ra, protecting him from chaos, ensuring that the sun would rise again tomorrow and the next day and every day for eternity. But the Duat's geography included more than just these 12 regions. Scattered throughout the underworld were specific, dangerous locations that the deceased needed to know about and avoid or navigate carefully. The Lake of Fire was mentioned in chapter 126 of the Book of the Dead. This was not a metaphorical place. The Egyptians genuinely believed there was a lake that burned with eternal flames that devoured those who fell into it. Some texts describe it as a place of punishment for the truly wicked, those whose hearts failed the weighing so spectacularly that even Ammit's consumption of their hearts was not punishment enough. Other texts suggest it was a barrier that had to be crossed, that the purifying flames burned away the last remnants of mortality, allowing the soul to achieve its immortal Ach form. The Lake of Chaos was a different body of water, also called the Waters of Non, the primordial waters that existed before creation. These waters were guarded by 4 baboons who sat in the prow of Ra's bark. The baboons were forces of both refreshment and destruction. If you knew the correct words, they would allow you to drink from the waters and be renewed. If you did not know the words, they would tear you apart. The dual nature of this lake exemplified the Duat's fundamental characteristic. Everything could help or harm depending on your knowledge, your preparation, your worthiness. Throughout the Duat, at regular intervals, were gates. Some texts mention 15 gates, others mention 21. The exact number varied between different versions and different periods, but what remained constant was their function. These gates separated one region from another, and each one was guarded by a deity or demon who would not allow passage unless you knew their name and could speak it correctly. The gates themselves had names. The guardians had names. Sometimes even the bolts and hinges had names that needed to be spoken. This was not arbitrary difficulty. It was a test of knowledge, of preparation, of whether you or your family had taken the time to learn the sacred texts, to study the spells, to prepare for this journey. The Book of the Dead provided these names and the phrases needed to pass each gate. For example, approaching the first gate, you would need to say, "I have come here to see the great gods. I live on the offerings of their cars. May I be given permission to pass through because I know you, I know your name, and I know the name of the God who guards you." Each gate required a similar declaration, a proof that you belonged, that you had the right to be there, that you were not some lost or ignorant soul stumbling blindly through the underworld. Between the gates, throughout all the regions, were countless deities and demons, some helpful and some hostile. There was Amher, whose name meant Devourer of Millions, or Eater of Eternity, a dog-headed god who lived in a lake of fire and hunted souls. There were serpents with multiple heads, each head requiring a different spell to neutralize. There were beings that appeared friendly, but would lead you astray if you trusted them. There were others that appeared monstrous, but were actually protectors, guides, helpers of the justified dead. The geography of the Duat was not static. Different texts describe it differently. Different periods emphasized different regions. This was not inconsistency. It was the recognition that the afterlife experience might vary for different individuals, that the underworld adapted to each soul's particular journey, that there was no single canonical map that would work for everyone. What mattered was not memorizing a specific layout, but understanding the principles. Know the names, speak the spells, remain on the path. Remember who you are and why you have come. And above all, guard your heart until the moment when it would be placed on the scales and judged. The Duat was vast, complex, and dangerous, but it was navigable. Thousands upon thousands of Egyptians had made this journey before you. They had faced the same rivers and deserts, the same gates and demons, the same choice between paradise and oblivion. And many of them had succeeded. Their success was your hope. Their knowledge, recorded in the text that covered your tomb walls and filled the papyrus scroll buried with you, was your guide. Anubis had brought you to the entrance. The geography of the Duat stretched before you, but you were not traveling unarmed. You had something more powerful than any weapon, more protective than any amulet, more essential than food or water. You had the words. You had the spells. You had the Book of the Dead. The Book of the Dead, your guide through darkness. There, in your tomb, placed carefully near your mummified body, or sometimes tucked directly into the linen wrappings, was a papyrus scroll. It might be several feet long, or it might stretch for dozens of yards. It might be beautifully illustrated with detailed vignettes showing gods and demons, or it might be plain text in black and red ink. It might contain nearly 200 separate spells, or just a handful of the most essential ones. The exact contents varied depending on when you lived, where you lived, how wealthy you were, and what dangers you most feared facing in the afterlife. But whatever form it took, this scroll was one of the most important objects buried with you. More important than jewelry, more important than furniture, more important than anything except perhaps the preservation of your body itself. Because this scroll which modern scholars call the Book of the Dead, was your instruction manual for navigating the Duat, your encyclopedia of names and spells, your passport and protection for the journey through the underworld. The ancient Egyptians did not call it the Book of the Dead. They called it Reu Nu Pert Em Ru, which translates to the Book of Coming Forth by Day, or the Book of Emerging into Light. The title tells you everything about its purpose. It was not a book about death, but a book about overcoming death, about emerging from the darkness of the Duat into the light of eternal life, about coming forth triumphant into the field of reeds where the blessed dead lived forever. The Book of the Dead was not a single standardized text like a modern book. There was no canonical version, no official edition, no central authority that determined which spells should be included and which should be left out. Instead, each Book of the Dead was custom-made for a specific individual. Scribes would consult with the person or their family, discuss which dangers they most feared, which gods they most wanted to appease, which spells they felt they needed most urgently. The resulting scroll was unique, personal, tailored to that individual's journey. The evolution of the Book of the Dead tells us much about how Egyptian attitudes toward death and the afterlife changed over millennia. The earliest funerary texts were the pyramid texts carved into the walls of pyramids during the Old Kingdom, around 2400 to 2300 BCE. These were exclusively for royalty, magical spells that would help the pharaoh ascend to the sky and join the gods, particularly Ra. The spells were powerful, complex, and reserved for those of divine blood. But as time passed, as Egypt moved into the Middle Kingdom around 2100 to 1700 BCE, these exclusive texts were adapted into what scholars call the coffin texts. These were painted on the interior sides of coffins, hence the name, and they were available to a much wider segment of society. Nobles, officials, wealthy merchants could now access the same protective spells that had once been reserved for pharaohs. This was the beginning of the democratization of the afterlife, the revolutionary idea that not just kings, but any person who lived a just life and could afford the proper burial preparations could achieve immortality. By the New Kingdom, around 1550 BCE and continuing until around 50 BCE, the texts evolved again into the form we call the Book of the Dead. Now written primarily on papyrus scrolls rather than on tomb or coffin walls, these texts were more accessible than ever before. The spells were standardized enough that scribes could prepare scrolls in advance, leaving blank spaces where the deceased's name would be inserted, but customizable enough that wealthy patrons could commission entirely unique versions. The spells in the Book of the Dead served multiple purposes, and understanding these purposes helps us understand what the Egyptians believed you would face in the Duat. Protection spells were perhaps the most common. These were words of power that would shield you from specific dangers. Spell 7, for example, protected against Apophis, the chaos serpent. You would declare, "Away from me, O crooked one! Beware, for I know your name. I am equipped with the spells which belong to Re, and the Ennead fears me." Speaking these words would cause Apophis to recoil, to recognize that you were not defenseless prey, but a soul equipped with divine knowledge. Other spells protected against more specific dangers. There were spells against snakes, against crocodiles, against demons with knives who guarded the gates. There were spells to prevent your heart from being stolen, spells to prevent your mouth from being sealed shut, spells to prevent your name from being forgotten. Each spell addressed a particular fear, a particular way you might be harmed or hindered in your journey. Transformation spells allowed you to change your form, to take on different shapes as needed. This ability was crucial because certain parts of the journey could not be completed in human form. Spell 77 allowed you to transform into a golden falcon, giving you the ability to fly and the connection to Horus, the god of kingship and the sky. Spell 78 transformed you into a divine hawk. Spell 81 allowed you to become Lotus Flower, symbol of rebirth and resurrection. These were not metaphorical transformations. The Egyptians believed you would actually take on these forms, that your Ba, which was already capable of taking bird form, could extend this shape-shifting ability to include other sacred creatures and plants. Knowledge spells were among the most important. These were not incantations to protect or transform, but declarations of knowledge, proofs that you knew the secret names, the hidden geography, the sacred truths of the underworld. Spell 144, for example, helped you know the names of the 7 gates and their guardians. You would recite, "I know you and I know your name. I know the name of the God who guards you." This was followed by the actual names, often strange, compounds like Inverter of Faces, whose 2 eyes are on fire, or Loud of Voice, who repels rebels. The most famous spell in the Book of the Dead is spell 125, which deals with the judgment of the soul in the Hall of Truth. This spell is actually a combination of declarations known as the Negative Confession and instructions for the Weighing of the Heart ceremony. We will explore this spell in great detail when we discuss the judgment itself. But it's worth noting here that spell 125 takes up more space in most Books of the Dead than any other spell, often accompanied by elaborate illustrations showing the whole scene of judgment. This tells us how central the weighing ceremony was to Egyptian afterlife beliefs and how important it was to be prepared for that moment. Another crucial spell was spell 30B, often inscribed not on papyrus but directly on heart scarabs, amulets placed over the mummified heart. This spell addressed the heart directly, commanding it not to testify against its owner during the judgment. O my heart which I had from my mother, O my heart of my different ages, do not stand up as a witness against me. Do not be opposed to me in the tribunal. Do not be hostile to me in the presence of the keeper of the balance. The heart knew everything you had done, every secret sin, every moment of cruelty or selfishness or dishonesty. It could betray you in the judgment hall, could reveal truths you wished hidden. Spell 30B. Attempted to ensure the heart would remain silent, would not add weight to the scales by confessing sins. The Egyptians recognized the danger of your own memory, your own conscience becoming the instrument of your condemnation. The Book of the Dead also contained spells for practical concerns in the afterlife. Spell 72 ensured you would be able to emerge from your tomb when needed. Spell 105 ensured you would please your car when you appeared before it. Spell 189 prevented you from being upside down in the afterlife, from losing orientation or direction. These might seem like minor concerns, but they reflect the Egyptian attention to detail, their desire to prepare for every possible difficulty. Many spells were accompanied by vignettes, illustrations that showed the spell in action or depicted the beings the spell addressed. These images were not merely decorative. The Egyptians believed that images had power, that a drawn representation of a protective deity actually provided protection, that a painted spell was as effective as a spoken one. This is why some Books of the Dead contained detailed illustrations, even when the text of the spell was abbreviated or absent. The image itself was the spell, activated by the presence of the soul, working automatically to protect and guide. The longest known Book of the Dead is the Greenfield Papyrus, now in the British Museum, which measures an astounding 121 feet long. Created for a woman named Nesitaneb Tashru around 950 BCE, it contains elaborate illustration and extensive text, a comprehensive guide that would have cost a fortune to produce. At the other end of the spectrum, Some books of the dead were just a few feet long, containing only the most essential spells that even a person of modest means could afford to have prepared. This democratization of the Book of the Dead, this transformation from exclusive royal texts to scrolls that anyone could potentially possess, represented a profound shift in Egyptian religious thought. It meant that immortality was not reserved for the elite, but was available to anyone who lived according to Ma'at, the cosmic principle of truth, order, and justice. A poor farmer who lived honestly, who treated others with kindness, who maintained balance in his life, could achieve the same eternal paradise as a pharaoh, if he had a Book of the Dead to guide him, and if his heart was light when it was weighed on the scales. Holding your Book of the Dead, either metaphorically in memory or perhaps carrying it as your ba traveled through the Duat, you would have felt more confident facing the dangers ahead. The spells were your armor and your weapons. The names were your passwords and your protection. The knowledge was your map and your compass. You were not wandering blindly through a hostile realm. You were an initiate, a prepared soul, someone who had studied and memorized and practiced for this journey. But even with the Book of the Dead, even with all the spells and names and transformations at your command, the journey was not easy. The demons did not always honor the words of power. The gates sometimes remained closed despite correct names. The geography shifted and changed. The Duat tested you in ways that magic alone could not overcome. Because ultimately, the Book of the Dead could not make you worthy if you were not. It could not make your heart light if it was heavy with sin. It could not speak the negative confession convincingly if you had violated Ma'at during your life. It could not save you from Ammit if your heart outweighed the feather. The Book of the Dead was essential, but it was not sufficient. You also needed the truth. You needed to have lived a life that, when examined by the gods, when measured on the golden scales, would prove worthy of paradise. And that examination, that measurement, that final judgment was coming. You had crossed the entrance to the Duat. You had journeyed through its regions. You had spoken the names and avoided the dangers. You had transformed when needed and called upon the gods for protection. You had done everything the Book of the Dead instructed. Now, as you entered the 6th hour, as you approached the abode of Osiris, you saw before you something that made even your immortal Ba tremble. A great hall, its entrance flanked by massive pylons, its interior lit by torches that never went out, its walls covered with images of the gods and the judgment of souls. This was the Hall of Two Truths, the Hall of Ma'at, the place where every soul who hoped to reach paradise must come. And inside that hall, waiting in 2 rows above the central scene, were the 42 divine judges who would decide your fate. Below them, the golden scales were ready. Anubis stood beside them, patient and prepared. Ammit crouched nearby, her crocodile jaws already open in anticipation. Your heart pounded in your chest, though you had no physical body to contain it. You had reached the moment that every Egyptian feared and prepared for their entire life. The weighing of the heart, the judgment of Osiris, the determination of whether you would live forever in paradise or be destroyed utterly in Ammit's jaws. The journey through the Duat had brought you here. Now you had to face the truth of who you had been in life. And the truth, in ancient Egypt, weighed exactly as much as a single feather. The Hall of Two Truths, standing before the judges. The Hall of Ma'at, also called the Hall of Two Truths or the Hall of Justice, was simultaneously a physical location in the Duat and a metaphysical space where the fundamental order of the universe manifested itself. To enter this hall was to stand in the presence of Ma'at herself, the goddess who embodied truth, justice, balance and cosmic order. Everything in this hall, every decoration, every figure, every element of the ceremony that would take place here reflected these principles. The architecture of the hall, as depicted in countless books of the dead, was impressive and intentional. Two great papyrus columns supported a roof decorated with alternating ostrich feathers, the symbol of Ma'at herself, and rearing cobras, symbols of protection and divine power. The columns represented the stability of truth, the foundational nature of justice. The feathers reminded you constantly what you would be measured against. The cobras warned that false testimony would not be tolerated, that lies spoken here would result in immediate destruction. Two goddesses, both representations of Ma'at, would lead you into the hall. This dual aspect, the two truths, the two Ma'ats, represented the double nature of truth itself. There was the truth of your outward actions, what you did in the world, how you treated others. And there was the truth of your inner self, your thoughts, your intentions, your heart. Both had to be in alignment. Both had to reflect Ma'at. You could not have behaved virtuously while harboring evil thoughts, nor could you have meant well while acting cruelly. The two truths demanded complete integrity, perfect alignment between action and intention. As you entered the hall, you would see, seated on a great throne at the far end, the lord of the underworld himself, Osiris. He was depicted as a mummified figure, his skin often shown as green or black, green for vegetation and renewal, black for the fertile soil and rebirth. He wore the Atef crown, a tall white crown flanked by ostrich feathers and sometimes topped with a sun disk, and cobra. He held the crook and flail, symbols of kingship and authority, crossed over his chest. His eyes, painted with the iconic Egyptian eye makeup, were calm but penetrating, seeing not just your form, but your essence, your soul, the truth of who you really were. Behind Osiris stood his wife Isis and her sister Nephthys, goddesses who had protected him in death, and who now extended that protection to all the justified dead. Before him, growing from a primordial mound, were the four sons of Horus standing on a lotus flower: Imseti, Hapi, Duamutef, and Kebeh-Senuef, the gods who protected the organs stored in canopic jars and who now bore witness to the judgment. But the most striking feature of the hall was not at the far end with Osiris. It was in the central space, illuminated by flickering torchlight, where the scales stood. These were not ordinary scales, but the scales of Ma'at, the scales of justice, capable of measuring not weight in any physical sense, but the moral weight of a soul, the balance or imbalance of a life lived. The scales themselves were supported by a stand shaped like the hieroglyph for truth, and they gleamed with gold, reflecting the light and seeming to pulse with their own inner luminescence. But before we examine the weighing ceremony itself, we must address the figures who held almost as much power in this room as Osiris himself. The 42 judges, also called the 42 assessors of Ma'at. They sat in 2 rows, one above the other, along the walls of the hall, 21 on each side. Each judge was a god or a divine being, each associated with one of the 42 nomes, the administrative districts of Egypt. This was symbolically significant. The judges represented all of Egypt, the totality of the land and its people, ensuring that no sin could be hidden, no crime overlooked, no virtue ignored. Your judgment would be comprehensive, complete, missing nothing. Each of the 42 judges had a specific name and a specific sin they monitored. One judge, Amkaibit, was concerned with murder. Another, Kerti, dealt with adultery. A third, Nehebkau, watched for arrogance and pride. and so on through the entire catalogue of sins that the Egyptians recognized, from theft to lying, from violence to gossip, from cruelty to animals to disrespect for the gods. Each judge wore a feather of Ma'at on his head, identifying him as an assessor of truth. Each held a knife, a reminder that justice could be swift and sharp, that those who failed the test would not be given second chances. The 42 judges did not speak during the ceremony, at least not aloud. Their judgment was silent, internal, based on what they saw in your heart and what they heard in your confession. But their presence was essential. They represented the collective conscience of Egypt, the accumulated wisdom about what constituted a good life and what constituted sin. To stand before them was to face not just divine judgment, but the judgment of your entire civilization, every person who had ever lived under Ma'at, every concept of right and wrong that Egyptian culture had developed over thousands of years. Now, as you stood in the center of this hall, between the throne of Osiris at one end and the entrance through which you had come at the other, with the scales directly before you and the 42 judges looking down from their elevated positions, the ceremony would begin. Anubis would step forward, his jackal head impassive, his hands gentle but firm as he prepared to take your heart. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, writing, and knowledge, would take his position as scribe, ready to record the results of the weighing. Ma'at herself, in her aspect as the feather, would be placed on one side of the scales. And near the scales, visible in your peripheral vision, but too terrible to look at directly, Ammit would crouch, waiting. But before the weighing could occur, before your heart could be removed from your chest and placed on the scales, you had to speak. You had to declare yourself innocent of the 42 sins that the 42 judges monitored. You had to recite what scholars call the negative confession, a litany of denials, a comprehensive statement of all the things you did not do during your life. This confession was preserved in spell 125 of the Book of the Dead, and every Egyptian who hoped to reach paradise had to memorize it, had to be able to recite it clearly and confidently in this moment of ultimate trial. The confession was structured carefully, with each denial addressed to a specific judge, calling him by name, identifying which sin you were denying. You would begin, "Hail, Usek Nemt, who comest forth from Anu, I have not committed sin." Then, turning to address each judge in sequence, "Hail, Heptket, who comest forth from Keraha, I have not committed robbery with violence. Hail, Fenti, who comest forth from Kemenu, I have not stolen. Hail, Amkaibit, who comest forth from Kernet, I have not slain men and women. Hail, Nehaha, who comest forth from Rasta, I have not stolen grain." The confession continued through all 42 denials. I have not practiced deceit. I have not robbed the gods' offerings. I have not told lies. I have not carried away food. I have not uttered evil words. I have not attacked anyone. I have not killed sacred animals. I have not stolen from the dead. I have not falsified weights or measures. I have not taken milk from the mouths of children. I have not driven cattle from their pastures. I have not snared birds belonging to the gods. I have not caught fish with bait made from similar fish. I have not diverted water in its season. I have not built a dam against flowing water. Some of the denials addressed moral issues we would recognize. I have not committed adultery. I have not been angry without cause. I have not made anyone weep. I have not been deaf to words of truth. Others reflected specifically Egyptian concerns. I have not multiplied my words in speaking. I have not acted with deceit. I have not cursed the king. I have not fouled running water. I have not exalted my speech. I have not been loud-voiced. The negative confession was not just a list of sins you had avoided. It was a positive statement of the kind of life you had lived, a life in accordance with Ma'at, the principle of truth and balance that underlay all Egyptian ethics. By denying these sins, you were asserting that you had lived justly, that you had treated others with respect, that you had not disrupted the cosmic order, that you had not added weight to your heart through wrongdoing. But here is what makes the negative confession so interesting and so psychologically sophisticated. The Egyptians knew people lied. They understood that standing in the hall of truth, facing eternal oblivion if you failed, you might be tempted to deny sins you had actually committed. They weren't naive about human nature. They knew fear makes people desperate, and desperation makes people dishonest. That's why the confession alone was never sufficient proof of innocence. That's why your heart, which knew the truth even if your mouth spoke lies, would be placed on the scales. The heart could not be fooled. The heart could not be bribed or threatened or convinced to forget. The Ib, as the Egyptians called it, was formed from a single drop of blood from your mother's heart at the moment of conception. It had recorded everything from the beginning. Every kindness offered, and every cruelty inflicted, every truth spoken, and every lie told, every moment when you chose Ma'at or chose to violate it. Here's the revelation that changes everything. The negative confession wasn't about convincing the gods you were innocent. It was about convincing yourself. The 42 judges listened, yes, but they already knew your sins. The weighing would reveal the truth regardless of your words. What the confession did was force you to confront the life you'd lived, to stand before divine witnesses and declare, out loud, with your own voice, what you believed about your conduct on earth. If you'd truly lived according to Ma'at, the words would flow easily, confidently. You would feel their truth as you spoke them. But if you'd committed the sins you were denying, something in your bar would recoil as you spoke the lies. The judges would see it. The gods would know it. And most importantly, your heart would grow heavier with each false denial, adding weight to the scales before they were even used. As you finished the negative confession, as the last denial left your lips and echoed through the hall, as the 42 judges considered your words in their silent, terrible way, Anubis would step forward. His hand would extend toward your chest. And though you had no physical body here, though you were soul and bar and essence, you would feel it. Feel your heart being removed, being taken, being carried toward the scales that would determine whether you continued to exist or ceased to be. The moment of weighing had arrived, and everything, your entire existence, past, present, and future, would be determined by whether your heart was as light as a single ostrich feather. The weighing of the heart, the moment of truth. The golden scales gleamed in the torchlight, their two pans hanging perfectly balanced, waiting. Anubis, with the careful precision of one who had performed this ceremony countless times, held your heart in his hands. It looked small there, vulnerable, a fragile thing that contained the entirety of your moral being. Thoth stood ready with his palette and reed pen, prepared to record the results. Your name, your life, your fate, all to be written in the eternal records of the dead. On one side of the scales, Ma'at herself, in her manifestation as a feather, was placed. The ostrich feather, pure white, impossibly light, yet containing all the weight of truth and justice and cosmic order. This feather was not just a symbol. It was Ma'at's essence, the physical representation of the principle that governed the universe. It represented balance, harmony, truth spoken and truth lived. actions that supported rather than disrupted the cosmic order. The feather represented something else, too, the achievable ideal. It was light because living according to Ma'at should be light, should be natural, should not burden the soul. If you had lived honestly, treated others with kindness, spoken truth, maintained balance in your relationships and your conduct, your heart should weigh the same as this feather, which is to say, it should be unburdened by sin, unweighted by guilt, free from the heavy accumulation of wrongs done and truths violated. Anubis held your heart above the empty pan of the scales. This was the moment. Every moment of your life had led to this. Every choice you had made, every word you had spoken, every action you had taken or failed to take, it was all about to be measured. Your family's offerings, your book of the dead, your knowledge of the spells, none of it mattered now. What mattered was who you had been when no one was watching, how you had treated people when there was no reward for kindness and no punishment for cruelty, whether you had lived according to Ma'at, not because the gods were watching, but because it was the right way to live. Slowly, carefully, with the deliberation of one performing the most important act in the universe, Anubis lowered your heart onto the empty pan. The scales moved, the pans shifted, seeking their natural balance, the point where weight matched weight, truth matched truth, life matched judgment. If you had lived well, if you had truly avoided the 42 sins, if your negative confession had been honest and your heart unburdened, the scales would balance. Heart and feather, equal in weight, equal in value. The pans would settle at the same level, neither rising nor falling, perfectly, beautifully balanced. When this happened, and the ancient Egyptians hoped and believed it would happen for most people, not just for the exceptional or the elite, several things would occur simultaneously. First, a visible sign of relief would pass through the hall. The 42 judges, though they did not speak, would somehow communicate their approval. The feathers on their heads would seem to glow brighter. The knives they held would lower, no longer threatening. Thoth would dip his reed pen in ink and write on his palette. The heart of your name weighs true. The deceased has not sinned. The deceased is justified. Let the deceased proceed to the field of reeds. The word used for justified was ma-keru, which means something like true of voice or vindicated. To be ma-keru was to have your words, your negative confession, confirmed as truth by the weighing of your heart. You had spoken truly. You were who you claimed to be. Osiris, from his throne at the end of the hall, would nod slowly. His expression would not change. It never changed. But somehow you would feel his approval, his acceptance, his welcome into the company of the blessed dead. He would gesture with the crook and flail, and that gesture would mean, yes, you may pass, you may enter paradise, you may live forever. Anubis would gently remove your heart from the scales and return it to you. You would feel it settle back into your chest, feel it resume beating, feel the relief and joy flooding through every part of your soul. You had passed. You were justified. You were ma-keru. You would live forever. But if the scales did not balance, if your heart sank, if it pulled the pan down, if it proved heavier than the feather of Ma'at, then everything changed. The hall itself seemed to darken. The torches flickered. The 42 judges leaned forward, their feathers dimming, their knives rising. Thoth's pen hovered over his palette, reluctant to record what he was about to write. Osiris's expression remained unchanged, but somehow conveyed not welcome, but sorrow, not acceptance, but rejection. This was the worst thing he had to do, this sending of souls into oblivion, but it was necessary. Justice demanded it. Ma'at required it. Those who had lived in violation of cosmic order could not be permitted to continue existing, could not be allowed to disrupt the eternal paradise with their presence. A heavy heart meant lies in the negative confession. It meant sins committed and unrepented. It meant cruelty enacted, truth violated, balance disrupted. It meant you had lived in opposition to Ma'at, had added to the forces of chaos and disorder, rather than supporting the forces of order and harmony. If your heart was heavier than the feather, Anubis would not return it to you. Instead, with a gesture both gentle and final, he would turn toward the figure crouched beside the scales, the composite creature that every Egyptian feared more than any demon of the Duat, more than any danger of the journey, more than death itself. Ammit, the Devourer, the Eater of Hearts. The Devourer and the second death. She waited there beside the scales, patient and hungry, as she had waited for thousands of years, as she would wait for thousands more. Ammit, the Devourer. And here's what you need to understand about her, something that gets lost in modern retellings that cast her as a villain or a monster. She wasn't evil. This distinction matters. Ammit didn't enjoy consuming hearts. She didn't revel in destruction. She felt no malice toward those she devoured. She was, scholars examining her role in funerary texts suggest, something closer to a natural force than a sentient being with preferences or desires. She was the inevitable consequence of injustice, the enforcement mechanism of Ma'at, the price that cosmic order demanded for those who had lived in violation of it. Think of her not as a demon, but as a law of physics made flesh. If water flows downhill, it's not being malicious. It's following its nature. If fire burns what it touches, it's not acting out of cruelty, it's simply being what it is. Ammit consumed hearts that were heavy with sin because that's what Ammit was created to do. She was the answer to a question that every civilization must grapple with. What happens to those who break the fundamental rules of society? What price does injustice pay? The Egyptians, with their characteristic precision, gave that price a face, and they made it terrifying, deliberately, systematically terrifying, because they understood something about human psychology that still holds true today. Fear of consequences shapes behavior more effectively than promises of rewards. The hope of the field of reeds motivated people, certainly. But the fear of Ammit's jaws, the absolute horror of the second death, of ceasing to exist entirely, that motivated people even more powerfully. Her name means devourer, or swallower of the dead, which tells you everything about her function and nothing about her character. She had no temples because she wasn't worshipped. You don't worship the executioner. She had no prayers directed to her because what could you possibly ask her for? Mercy? She had none to give. Her role was fixed, her nature unchangeable, her presence necessary to maintain the cosmic order that kept chaos at bay. Her appearance was deliberately terrifying, a composite of the three most dangerous animals known to ancient Egyptians. Her head was that of a crocodile, with its massive jaws capable of crushing bones, its teeth designed for tearing flesh, its predatory nature representing merciless, unstoppable force. Her forequarters and front legs were those of a lion, Egypt's apex land predator, symbol of power and ferocity, embodiment of strength that could not be overcome. Her hindquarters were those of a hippopotamus, deceptively named, perhaps, since hippopotami were among the most dangerous animals in ancient Egypt, responsible for more human deaths than crocodiles or lions, capable of overturning boats and crushing humans with their massive bulk. This combination was not random. Each animal represented a different aspect of death and judgment. The crocodile, The death that comes from the river, sudden and inevitable. The lion. The death that comes from the land, proud and fierce. The hippopotamus. The death that comes from seeming calm, hidden danger beneath a placid surface. Together, they created an image of death that was comprehensive, inescapable, final. Ammit sat close to the scales, close enough to reach the heart immediately if it failed the test. She was often depicted in a crouched position, ready to spring, her crocodile mouth already open, her eyes fixed on the heart being weighed. In some images, she appears eager, hungry, anticipating the feast. In others, she looks almost bored, professionally detached, simply doing the job she was created to do. This range of depictions reflects the Egyptians' complex feelings about her. She was terrifying, yes, but also necessary. A force of justice rather than evil, enforcement of moral law rather than arbitrary cruelty. If the heart was heavy, if it failed the weighing, Anubis would lift it from the scales and offer it to Ammit. Some texts suggest he would throw it to her, casting the guilty heart away from the divine presence. Others describe him placing it gently into her jaws, performing even this terrible duty with his characteristic care and precision. Ammit would devour the heart in a single motion. Her crocodile jaws would close, and the heart would be gone, consumed, destroyed, obliterated. And with the consumption of the heart went everything else. The heart was not just an organ in Egyptian belief, it was the repository of personality, memory, emotion, and identity. It was where the Ba and Ka were recorded, where your life was written, where your Ren, your true name, was known. When Ammit devoured your heart, she didn't just kill you, she unmade you. This was called the second death, and it was final in a way that the first death was not. The first death, the death of the body, was a transition. It was the door to the underworld, the beginning of a journey. You could survive the first death through mummification, offerings, spells, judgment. But there was no surviving the second death. No resurrection, no continuation, no transformation. You simply ceased to be. Your Ka would dissipate, no longer having a heart to sustain it. Your Ba would be unable to return to any body, having no anchor, no home. Your Akh would never form, the union of Ba and Ka impossible, without the heart to unite them. Your name, your Ren, would be forgotten, erased not just from monuments, but from existence itself. The offerings made by your family would have nowhere to go, no one to receive them. The tomb prepared for you would stand empty, occupied by a mummy, but not by a soul. The ancient Egyptians feared this absolutely. To them, non-existence was the worst fate imaginable, not pain. Pain could be endured, not isolation. Even the Duat's loneliest regions were better than non-being. Not even an eternity of punishment. At least punishment implied you still existed. But to cease to be, to have your very self consumed and destroyed, to pass from existence into absolute nothingness. This was terror beyond words. This is why Ammit was so effective as a force of moral enforcement. The threat of her consumption motivated people to live according to Ma'at, not out of love of virtue for its own sake necessarily, but out of fear of the alternative. Better to live honestly and justly and have a light heart than to take what you wanted, hurt whom you wanted, lie when convenient, and risk the second death. The Egyptians did not believe Ammit was evil. She was not punishing the innocent or acting capriciously. She was enforcing the will of Osiris, upholding the judgment of the 42 assessors, executing the sentence that the scales themselves had pronounced. In this sense, she was an agent of Ma'at, a protector of cosmic order, ensuring that only those who had lived in accordance with truth and justice could enter paradise and dwell there forever. Those who were devoured by Ammit were not sent to a hell realm to suffer eternally. There was no equivalent in Egyptian belief to the Christian hell or the Greek Tartarus. Instead, those who failed the weighing simply stopped existing. Their names were forgotten, their achievements erased, their very being consumed. It was obliteration, not torment. Nothingness, not punishment. Some texts suggest that the souls of the devoured became restless spirits, wandering the Duat forever without purpose or identity, unable to find peace but unable to achieve full non-existence either. These were the most pitiable beings in Egyptian belief, not evil enough to deserve eternal punishment if such a thing existed, but not good enough to pass the weighing, trapped in a liminal state between being and non-being, forever incomplete, forever lost. But most accounts suggest that Ammit's consumption was total and final. The heart entered her jaws, and then there was simply nothing. No afterlife, no awareness, no continuation of any kind. Just the end. This is why the heart scarabs with spell 30B were so important, why families spent precious resources on these amulets. They were trying to prevent the heart from testifying too honestly, from revealing sins that might tip the scales, from condemning its owner to Ammit's jaws. The ethical implications of this are interesting. Was it right to try to fool the judgment? Was spell 30B a form of cheating, of trying to pass the weighing without actually deserving to pass? The Egyptians don't seem to have worried about this too much. They saw spell 30B not as cheating, but as preparation, as equipping yourself for the test the way you might study, for an examination. The spell didn't make the heart lie, it simply prevented it from being too forthcoming, from offering information that wasn't directly asked for, from sabotaging you through excessive honesty. You still had to recite the negative confession truthfully. You still had to have avoided major sins. But the heart scarab gave you a chance, prevented the heart from being vindictive or from dwelling on minor failings that would add unnecessary weight to the scales. Standing in the Hall of Truth, watching Anubis lower your heart onto the scales, seeing Ammit's jaws already opening in anticipation, you would have felt the full weight, if you'll pardon the expression, of this moment. Everything hinged on this. Not whether you had memorized the right spells, not whether your tomb was properly equipped, not whether your family made sufficient offerings. Those things helped you reach this point, helped you survive the journey through the Duat, but they could not save you from the scales. Only the truth of how you had lived could do that. The scales would move. They would seek their balance. And you would either be justified, Ma'akaru, welcomed into paradise, or you would face the Devourer, the second death, the end of existence. But let us assume, for the sake of our journey together, that your heart was light. Let us imagine that you had lived well, that the scales balanced, that Anubis returned your heart to you with a gesture of approval, that Thoth wrote your name in the Book of the Justified, that Osiris welcomed you to continue on to your eternal reward. Where exactly were you going? What waited beyond the Hall of Truth for those who passed the test? What did paradise look like to the ancient Egyptians? What was this field of reeds, this Aru that they spoke of with such longing and prepared for with such care? The field of reeds, paradise perfected. You emerged from the Hall of Truth transformed. No longer were you a soul in transit, a bar traveling through dangerous territory, a heart hoping to pass judgment. You were now Ma'akaru, justified, transformed. The Ba and Ka had reunited to form the Ach, the glorified spirit, the immortal self. You were no longer merely dead. You were among the blessed dead, the ones who would live forever in the presence of the gods. Anubis or another guide would lead you from the hall, and you would board a boat. Not just any boat, but a divine bark, similar to the solar bark that carried Ra through the sky each day and through the Duat each night. The boat would carry you across waters that were both literal and symbolic, waters that marked the final boundary between the realm of judgment and the realm of reward, between the testing of the Duat and the peace of paradise. The journey across these waters was not long, but it was significant. You were leaving behind all possibility of failure, all danger, all uncertainty. The Duat's perils could no longer touch you. The demons had no power over the justified dead. The gates would open automatically at your approach. You were under the protection of Osiris himself now, marked as one of his own, counted among the company of those who had lived well and died successfully. And then, as the boat approached the far shore, you would see it, the field of reeds, Aru, Sekhet Aru, the paradise that every Egyptian hoped to reach. But here's something that might surprise you about Egyptian paradise, something that reveals a profound truth about what the ancient Egyptians actually valued. It wasn't rest. It wasn't endless leisure. It wasn't freedom from work or responsibility. The field of reeds was Egypt perfected. Yes, but it was still Egypt. Still agricultural, still requiring labor, still demanding that you plant and harvest, that you maintain irrigation canals, that you perform the daily tasks that defined Egyptian life. The difference wasn't the absence of work. The difference was that the work always succeeded, never exhausted you, never broke your body or crushed your spirit. The crops never failed. The floods never destroyed. The harvest always came. But you still had to do it. This reveals something profound about Egyptian values, about what they considered truly precious. Modern cultures often envision paradise as escape from labor, from struggle, from the demands of survival. We fantasize about doing nothing, about having every need met without effort. The Egyptians, shaped by millennia of agricultural life along the Nile, saw purpose differently. Work wasn't what made life difficult. Failure was what made life difficult. Exhaustion was what made it difficult. Death was what made it difficult. Paradise, to them, meant continuing the life you knew and loved, but without the parts that made it painful. You still farmed, but the soil was perfectly fertile. You still tended animals, but they were healthy and abundant. You still built and created and labored, but none of it depleted you, none of it failed, none of it ended in loss or decay or death. The Egyptians didn't want to transcend their human existence. They wanted to perfect it, to take everything they loved about life along the Nile and remove only what caused suffering. This is why Aru is often described as looking exactly like the Nile Delta, why it includes the same crops, the same animals, the same activities as earthly Egypt. It wasn't a different world. It was this world, healed. The field of reeds stretched before you as far as you could see, lush, green, vibrant with life. Fields of barley and wheat swayed in a gentle breeze, golden and ripe, always ready for harvest. Between the fields ran irrigation canals, crystalline waters that flowed without effort, that never ran dry, that needed no maintenance. Beyond the fields were gardens with date palms and fig trees, sycamores and perseas, all bearing fruit constantly, the harvest never ending because the growing season never ended. The sky above was perpetually the deep, perfect blue of a cloudless Egyptian day. The air was warm but comfortable, dry but not parching. There was no dust, no heat shimmering off the desert, no sandstorms, no plague of locusts or any other affliction that troubled Egypt in the mortal world. This was Egypt without any of the hardships that made life difficult, all of the beauty and none of the struggle. But Aru was not a place of idleness. The Egyptians did not envision paradise as eternal rest or passive enjoyment. Even in paradise, there was work to be done. But this was work transformed, work that was joy rather than toil, labor that fulfilled rather than exhausted. You would have your own plot of land in Aru, assigned to you fairly regardless of your earthly status. Rich and poor received equal allotments in paradise, a revolutionary idea that reflected the democratization of the afterlife. This land was fertile beyond imagination, producing crops without weeds, without insects to destroy them, without droughts or floods to ruin the harvest. You would plow and sow and reap, but the work would be effortless, or at least much easier than it had been on earth. Your body, your Sahu, the spiritual body that accompanied your Ah, would never tire, never ache, never age. And if even this easy work seemed too much, you had help. Remember those Shabti figures buried in your tomb? Those small servant statues, often dozens or even hundreds of them, inscribed with Chapter 6 of the Book of the Dead? They would come to life in Aru and perform the necessary labor for you. Call upon them, speak the spell inscribed on their backs, and they would tend your fields, harvest your crops, dig your irrigation canals. You could recline in the shade of your sycamore tree, drink date wine, and watch your Shabti workers maintain your estate while you enjoyed eternal leisure. The waters of Aru were not just for irrigation. There were rivers for fishing, fish that would practically leap onto your hook that required no real effort to catch. There were lakes for fowling, ducks and geese that flew in predictable patterns, that could be brought down with throw sticks, that would provide meat for feasts without ever depleting the populations. Everything you enjoyed in Egypt, the sports, the foods, the activities, was available in Aru, but perfected, made easy, stripped of hardship. Your home in Aru would be exactly as you left it on Earth, but better. If you had lived in a modest house of mud brick, you would find that house here, but the bricks would never crack, the roof would never leak, the walls would never need repair. If you had been wealthy enough to have a villa with courtyards and gardens, you would find it here, eternally beautiful, eternally comfortable. The furniture would never wear out. The decorations would never fade. The paintings on the walls would remain vibrant forever. And you would not be alone. Everyone you had ever loved who had died before you and passed the weighing of the heart would be there. Your parents, your grandparents, your children who had died young, your friends, your beloved spouse. The reunions the Egyptians imagined in Aru were one of the most powerful aspects of their paradise. Death separated families, but Aru reunited them. You would spend eternity with those you loved, never separated again, never losing anyone again, all of you together in perfect harmony. Even your pets would be there. The Egyptians loved their animals, their dogs and cats, their monkeys and birds. These creatures were not merely possessions, but family members, companions. Many tombs include images of favorite pets, prayers that they would be reunited in the afterlife. In Aru, your old dog would be there, young and healthy again, ready to play. Your cat would curl in your lap, purring, just as she did when you both lived. No creature you loved would be absent from paradise. The gods themselves dwelt in Aru, or at least visited regularly. You might see Ra in his solar bark passing overhead, bringing eternal day to this paradise that had no night. You might encounter Thoth in his aspect as the wise teacher, or Hathor bringing joy and music, or Osiris himself walking among his subjects, ensuring their happiness and answering their prayers. The gods were more accessible here than they had been on Earth, more visible, more present, because this was their realm as much as it was yours. But Aru was also described as existing in multiple forms or manifestations. Some texts describe it as a series of islands, each one perfect, each one covered with fields of reeds and grains, separated by clear streams. These islands were the blessed dead's homes, their eternal estates. Other texts describe Aru as a single vast plain, stretching to infinity in all directions, divided into plots for each soul, but forming one unified paradise. The variation in descriptions suggests that Aru adapted to each person's vision of paradise, that what you saw there reflected what you most desired, what would bring you the most happiness. There was no crime in Aru, no conflict, no jealousy or anger or any negative emotion. How could there be? Everyone there had passed the weighing of the heart, had been judged worthy by Osiris and the 42 assessors. Everyone had lived according to Ma'at. Everyone was virtuous, justified, deserving. You were surrounded by the best people who had ever lived, those who had chosen truth over lies, justice over exploitation, balance over chaos. Living among such souls, sustained by eternal plenty, protected by the gods themselves, how could anything but happiness exist? The Egyptians called Aru the field of reeds because reeds were the quintessential plant of the Nile Delta, the marker of wetlands and fertility, the symbol of Egypt's agricultural wealth. To say you dwelt among the reeds was to say you dwelt in the best, most fertile, most prosperous part of Egypt. It was a shorthand for paradise that every Egyptian would immediately understand and respond to emotionally. But Aru was not the only possible afterlife destination for the justified dead. Some texts describe an alternative or additional reward, joining Ra on his eternal journey through the sky. Each day, Ra's solar bark would travel from east to west across the heavens, bringing light and warmth to the world. Each night, the bark would descend into the Duat, traveling through its 12 hours, battling Apophis and the forces of chaos, ensuring that order would triumph and the sun would rise again. If you chose this path, or if it was offered to you as an alternative to Aru, you would become one of Ra's crew, one of the blessed dead who sailed with the sun god forever. You would help defend the bark against Apophis's attacks. You would chant the spells that weakened the Chaos Serpent. You would row when needed, navigate when required, serve as warrior or priest or musician or any role that Ra's journey required. This was an active afterlife rather than a restful one, an eternal adventure rather than eternal leisure. Some texts suggest that you could alternate, dwelling in Aru during the day and joining Ra's bark at night, participating in both forms of blessed existence, enjoying both peace and action, both rest and purposeful labor. The vision of the field of reeds reveals much about what the ancient Egyptians valued. They did not see work as inherently bad or rest as inherently good. They valued purposeful activity, meaningful labor, the satisfaction of planting and harvesting, of creating and building. They valued family and community, the bonds between people, the joy of reuniting with loved ones. They valued the familiar over the alien, the perfected Egypt over some completely different realm. They wanted not to escape their world, but to perfect it, not to abandon their lives, but to continue them without suffering or death or loss. And they achieved this vision, at least for those who passed the weighing. For those who were justified, who became Ma'akaru, who were welcomed by Osiris and ferried to the field of reeds, paradise was not a vague promise, but a specific, detailed, achievable destination. They knew what it looked like, knew what they would do there, knew who they would meet, knew that their existence would continue forever in a state of peace and plenty. This was what made all the preparation worthwhile. The expense of mummification, the commissioning of tomb texts, the memorization of spells, the attention to living according to Ma'at. This was the reward, the goal, the promise that motivated millions of Egyptians over thousands of years to face death not with terror, but with hope, not with despair, but with confidence that if they had lived well, they would live forever. Your journey through the Duat had reached its destination. The field of reeds stretched before you, perfect and eternal. You had faced death and survived it. You had navigated the underworld and overcome its dangers. You had stood in judgment and been found worthy. You had avoided Ammit's jaws and received Osiris's welcome. Now you would rest, would feast, would laugh with your loved ones, would work your perfect fields, would live forever in a paradise that was everything Egypt was, but nothing Egypt lacked. The blessed afterlife, the culmination of 3 millennia of religious thought and spiritual hope, was yours. But before we leave our journey through the Egyptian afterlife, we should return to the beginning, to the preparation that made this journey possible, to the practices and beliefs that transformed death from ending to transition, from loss to transformation. We should speak of mummification and tomb building, of offerings and prayers, of the complex machinery of Egyptian funerary practice that supported and enabled this elaborate vision of life after death. Preserving the body, the sacred art of mummification. The journey through the Duat, the weighing of the heart, the paradise of the field of reeds, all of this required one fundamental thing: a preserved body. Without the cart intact, the car would have nowhere to return. Without the car's nightly reunion with the corpse, the car would dissipate. Without the car, the bar could not reunite with it to form the Ach. The entire afterlife journey depended on keeping the physical body as intact as possible for as long as possible. Ideally, forever. This is why the ancient Egyptians developed mummification, a process so sophisticated and effective that bodies preserved 3,000 years ago still survive today. Recognizable, identifiable, bearing silent witness to the skill of the embalmers who prepared them. Mummification was not just a practical technique for preserving corpses. It was a sacred ritual, a series of magical acts that transformed the dead from a simple corpse into a vessel capable of housing the soul elements, a form that could participate in the afterlife journey. The process began immediately after death, or as soon as possible after death. Time was the enemy. Decay set in quickly in Egypt's hot climate. The body would be taken to a place called the Beautiful House, or the Place of Purification, a workshop where the embalmers performed their craft. These were priests, not merely technicians, and their patron was Anubis himself. When performing mummification, the chief embalmer would often wear a jackal mask, embodying the god, channeling his power and knowledge into the work. The first step was washing the body with water from the Nile and wine from palm trees, purifying it, preparing it for the sacred transformations to come. Then came the most delicate and dangerous part of the process, removing the internal organs, which would decay quickly if left in place. The embalmers made an incision in the left side of the abdomen, reaching inside to carefully extract the stomach, intestines, liver, and lungs. These organs were not discarded but preserved separately, each one placed in its own canopic jar, protected by one of the 4 sons of Horus. The lungs went into the jar guarded by Hapi, baboon-headed god of the north. The stomach was placed in the jar protected by Duat, jackal-headed god of the east. The intestines went to Senuef, falcon-headed god of the west. The liver was given to Imseti, human-headed god of the south. Each god, each direction, each organ played its role in the cosmic geography of the preserved body. But one organ was never removed: the heart. The Ib, the seat of consciousness and memory, the record of all your deeds, the essential element that would be weighed in the hall of truth. This had to remain in the body. Removing the heart would have been spiritual murder, destroying the very core of who you were. So the heart stayed, carefully positioned, often with a heart scarab placed over it, inscribed with spell 30B to ensure it would not betray you during judgment. The brain, interestingly, was removed and discarded. The Egyptians did not understand the brain's function, did not recognize it as the seat of thought or consciousness. They saw it as insignificant, just tissue that would decay. They removed it by inserting a long hook through the nose, breaking through the ethmoid bone, and pulling out the brain matter in pieces. This sounds brutal, but it left no visible mark on the face and removed an organ that would otherwise rot and cause problems during the mummification process. With the organs removed, the body cavity was cleaned and rinsed with palm wine and spices. Then came the most critical step in preservation: desiccation. The body was completely covered with natron, a naturally occurring salt compound found in certain areas of Egypt. Natron absorbed moisture with remarkable efficiency. The body would be left buried in natron for 40 days, sometimes 70, allowing every bit of moisture to be drawn out. Bacteria need water to function. Without water, they cannot cause decay. The natron transformed the flesh from soft, perishable tissue into dry, preserved material that could last for millennia. After the natron treatment, the body was removed, washed again, and the real art of mummification began. The embalmers packed the body cavity with linen, sawdust, or other materials to restore the body's shape, which had collapsed during desiccation. They placed amulets throughout the wrappings: scarabs, djed pillars, Tayat knots, each one a source of magical protection, each one inscribed with spells from the Book of the Dead. The wrapping itself was a ritual that could take 15 days. The embalmers wrapped each finger and toe individually, then the limbs, then the torso, then the head, all the while reciting prayers and incantations. Between the layers of linen, they placed more amulets, more protective images. The wrapping was not haphazard, but precise, following patterns that had been developed over centuries, ensuring that the body was protected from both physical and spiritual harm. The final step was placing a mask over the face. For royalty and the very wealthy, this would be a gold mask showing the deceased as they hoped to appear in the afterlife, youthful and perfect. For others, it might be a simple painted cartonnage mask, a plaster mask, or no mask at all. But the intention was the same: to preserve the face, to maintain identity, to ensure recognition. The completed mummy was placed in a coffin, often itself shaped like a human, decorated with protective images and texts. Wealthier individuals might have multiple nested coffins, each one more elaborate than the last, creating layers of protection. The innermost coffin would be placed in a stone sarcophagus, and this ensemble would be positioned in the tomb, carefully oriented, surrounded by the objects and texts that would help the deceased navigate the afterlife. But the tomb itself was more than a storage place for the mummy. It was a house for the dead, a residence where the Ka would dwell, a threshold between worlds. Tomb construction was an art form and an act of love, preparation for death made during life. The simplest tombs were just pits in the ground, the mummy placed inside, covered with sand and rocks. But even these humble burials often included grave goods, pottery for food and drink, simple jewelry, basic necessities for the afterlife. As wealth increased, so did tomb complexity. Mastaba tombs, rectangular structures with flat roofs, gave way to the pyramids of the Old Kingdom, those massive monuments that still dominate the Egyptian landscape. But pyramids were only for royalty. Most people built tombs in rock cliffs or underground chambers, spaces that could be sealed to protect the mummy from thieves and the elements. Inside the tomb, the walls were covered with texts and images, scenes from the deceased's life, maps of the Duat, spells from the Book of the Dead, prayers to the gods. These were not decorations. They were functional, magical texts that would come alive when needed, that would guide and protect the deceased through the afterlife journey. In some tombs, entire copies of funerary texts covered every available surface, creating a three-dimensional Book of the Dead that surrounded and protected the deceased. The tomb also contained the necessities of life: food and drink, clothing and jewelry, furniture and tools. For royalty, this could mean vast treasures. Witness the tomb of Tutankhamun, filled with gold and precious objects, thousands of items intended to serve the young pharaoh in eternity. But even modest tombs contained the basics: bread and beer, meat and vegetables, oils and linens. These offerings were not meant to last forever. They would eventually spoil. But the Egyptians believed the ka consumed the essence of the offerings, not the physical objects themselves. As long as new offerings were brought regularly, the ka would be sustained. This brings us to one of the most important aspects of Egyptian funerary practice: the obligations of the living to the dead. Death did not sever family connections. It transformed them. The living had a sacred duty to care for their dead ancestors, to make offerings, to speak their names, to maintain their tombs. This was not optional. It was a religious and social obligation that bound generations together, that ensured the dead were not forgotten, that guaranteed they would continue receiving the sustenance their ka needed. Families would visit the tomb on specific feast days: birthdays, death anniversaries, important religious festivals. They would bring fresh offerings, would pour libations of beer or wine, would speak the names of the deceased aloud, would recite prayers. These acts kept the deceased alive in a very real sense. As long as someone remembered you, spoke your name, brought offerings, you continued to exist in the afterlife. Your ka was nourished, your ren was preserved, your connection to the world of the living remained intact. This is why childlessness was so feared in ancient Egypt. If you had no children to make offerings, no family to remember you, your afterlife would be in jeopardy. You might pass the weighing of the heart, might be admitted to the field of reeds, but without offerings from the living, you might not have the strength to enjoy it. Some people would hire priests as ka servants, paying them to make regular offerings at the tomb in perpetuity. Others would establish endowments, setting aside resources to ensure their cult would continue. The connection between life and death, between the living and the dead, was fundamental to Egyptian religion. The opening of the mouth ceremony exemplified this connection. Performed before the tomb was sealed, this ritual involved touching the mummy's mouth with sacred instruments while reciting specific spells. The purpose was to restore the senses, to allow the deceased to breathe, to eat and drink the offerings, to speak the spells needed in the afterlife, to see and hear and experience the world once more. Death had closed these faculties. The opening of the mouth reopened them, transforming the inert mummy into a living, functioning being in the spiritual realm. All of this, the mummification, the tomb construction, the offerings, the ceremonies, required resources. It required time, money, expertise, planning. The poor might receive only basic mummification, might be buried in simple graves with few offerings. But even the poorest Egyptians tried to preserve the body somehow, tried to provide at least minimal protection and provisions. The ideal of eternal life was not reserved for the elite. Everyone hoped to achieve it. Everyone believed it was possible if you lived according to Ma'at and received proper burial. This is the great gift of Egyptian religion. It offered eternal life to all, not just to kings or heroes. It said that what mattered was not your status in life, but the content of your heart, the truth of your words, the justice of your actions. A poor farmer who lived honestly could achieve the same eternal paradise as a pharaoh, if his body was preserved, if he knew the spells, if his heart was light when weighed. This democratization of immortality is one of ancient Egypt's greatest contributions to human religious thought. Standing now at the end of our journey through the Egyptian afterlife, we can see it as a complete system, a comprehensive answer to humanity's eternal questions about death and what comes after. The Egyptians did not shy away from death's reality. They faced it directly, mapped it precisely, prepared for it exhaustively. But they transformed it from ending to transition, from loss to transformation, from darkness into light. Reflections on Eternity, the legacy of Egyptian afterlife. Beliefs: the sun is rising now, if we imagine ourselves still and in the eternal present of our journey. You have traversed the Duat, passed through its 12 regions, faced its demons and gates, spoken the names and recited the spells. You have stood in the hall of truth before the 42 judges. You have watched Anubis place your heart on the scales. You have felt the relief, the joy, the profound gratitude when the scales balanced, when your heart proved as light as Ma'at's feather. You have been ferried to the field of reeds, have reunited with your loved ones, have taken possession of your eternal estate in paradise. The journey is complete, but in another sense, it has only just begun. Eternity stretches before you, an endless expanse of days in perfected Egypt, a life without end in the presence of the gods. You will wake each morning in your home in Aru. You will tend your fields, or let your Shabti do it for you. You will feast and laugh with your family. You will walk through gardens that never fade. You will drink from waters that never run dry. You will watch Ra's bark pass overhead each day, knowing that you are safe, that you are home, that you are forever. This was the hope, the promise, the vision that sustained ancient Egyptian civilization for more than 3,000 years. From the first pyramid built at Saqqara around 2700 BCE to the last hieroglyphic inscriptions carved in the 4th century CE, Egyptians believed in this afterlife, prepared for this journey, oriented their entire culture around the conviction that death was not the end but transformation, that eternal life was achievable, that paradise awaited those who lived well and were properly prepared. How did these beliefs evolve over those 3 millennia? In the earliest periods, the Old Kingdom, the afterlife was primarily royal. Pharaohs ascended to the sky to join Ra, or descended to the underworld to join Osiris. The pyramid texts carved into royal burial chambers described these journeys in detail. Commoners, if they had any afterlife at all, seem to have been thought of as existing in their tombs, sustained by offerings but not traveling through the Duat or reaching paradise. But by the Middle Kingdom, this exclusivity began to break down. The coffin texts adapted the royal spells for non-royal use. Nobles and officials could now aspire to the same afterlife as pharaohs. The democratization had begun. Osiris, rather than Ra, became the central deity of the afterlife, Perhaps because Osiris represented death and resurrection for everyone, not just the divine kings. His myth, murdered by Set, mourned by Isis, resurrected to rule the underworld, made him relatable, a god who had experienced death and overcome it. By the New Kingdom, when the Book of the Dead became widespread, the afterlife was theoretically available to anyone. Yes, you needed resources for proper mummification and burial. Yes, you needed to be literate or wealthy enough to commission tomb texts. But the ideal was universal immortality. Anyone who lived according to Ma'at, anyone whose heart was light, anyone who knew the spells, regardless of their social status, could achieve eternal life. This evolution reflects broader changes in Egyptian society: the gradual empowerment of non-royal classes, the development of a more sophisticated theology that grappled with questions of justice and morality, rather than simply asserting the divine right of kings. The afterlife became a reward for ethical behavior rather than a prerogative of birth. This was revolutionary. The Egyptian afterlife also influenced the religious traditions that came after it. Early Christianity, developing in Egypt and the Eastern Mediterranean, incorporated elements of Egyptian belief: the judgment of souls, the weighing of deeds, the division of the blessed from the damned. The Greek Orphic mysteries and Pythagorean teachings absorbed Egyptian ideas about the soul's journey after death. Islamic concepts of the barzakh, the realm between death and resurrection, echo the Egyptian Duat. The persistence of Egyptian afterlife imagery in Western art, from medieval paintings of the Last Judgment to modern depictions of heaven, testifies to the lasting power of these ancient visions. But perhaps the most important legacy of Egyptian afterlife beliefs is this: they treated death seriously without treating it as defeat. They acknowledged the fear of non-existence while asserting that existence could continue. They faced the hardest questions. What happens when we die? Do we continue? How? Where? Why? And answered with extraordinary detail, with maps and spells and names, with a whole geography of death and rebirth. The modern world has largely lost this. We avoid death, euphemize it, medicalize it, hide it away in hospitals and funeral homes. We have no maps of the afterlife, no confident descriptions of paradise, no spells to recite or names to know. We have hope, perhaps, or faith, but not the kind of detailed, practical certainty that allowed an ancient Egyptian to face death with relative calm, knowing exactly what would happen next, knowing the path through the underworld, knowing that if their heart was light, they would live forever. There is something both admirable and sad about this loss. Admirable because it reflects our scientific skepticism, our refusal to accept comfortable myths without evidence. Sad because it leaves us without the comfort those myths provided, without the community rituals that bound the living and the dead, without the assurance that death is transition rather than ending. The ancient Egyptians believed that speaking the name of the dead kept them alive, that making offerings sustained their ka, that remembering them ensured their continued existence. In that spirit, by telling their stories, by mapping their afterlife, by walking with them through the Duat and standing with them at the scales of judgment, we have kept them alive tonight. The pharaohs and priests who developed these beliefs, the embalmers who preserved the dead, the scribes who copied the spells, the families who made offerings, all of them are remembered. Their names are spoken. Their Ren endures. And perhaps, in some small way, by understanding their journey, by imagining ourselves making that same passage through the Duat, we have confronted our own mortality, our own questions about what comes after, our own hopes for continuation. The ancient Egyptians' answers may not be ours, but their questions certainly are. What happens after death? Will we continue? Will we see our loved ones again? Is there justice in the universe? Is there meaning in our lives? Does how we live matter? The Egyptians answered yes. Yes, you continue. Yes, you will see your loved ones. Yes, there is justice. It awaits you at the scales. Yes, there is meaning. How you live determines where you go after death. Yes, your choices matter. Your heart records them all, and the feather of Ma'at will reveal the truth. Whether we believe these specific answers is less important than recognizing that the Egyptians took the questions seriously, that they built an entire civilization around preparing for death and hoping for eternity, that they offered their people not vague promises but detailed maps, not distant hopes but practical preparations, not fear of death but confidence in transformation. As our journey together ends, as the sun rises over the Nile one more time, as we return from the field of reeds to our own world and time, we must confront one final truth, perhaps the most important one of all. The ancient Egyptians are long gone. The priests who recited the spells are dust. The embalmers who prepared the bodies are themselves mummified or lost. The temples where the rituals were performed are ruins. The pyramids and tombs they built with such care have been looted by thieves and studied by archaeologists. The civilization that believed so strongly in eternal life has itself died. And yet the Egyptians achieved something that might be more lasting than any paradise they imagined. They made themselves unforgettable. Every pharaoh's name carved into temple walls, every commoner's title recorded on a tomb, every text that began with, "I have not committed sin." These were attempts to achieve immortality through memory, through the power of the spoken name, through Ren enduring beyond the reach of death. Here's the twist that recontextualizes this entire journey. They succeeded. Not in the way they expected, perhaps. The field of reeds exists only in their imaginations and in ours as we recreate it. The weighing of the heart happened in their beliefs, but not in any measurable reality we can access. Ammit never actually devoured any literal hearts, but their names endure, their stories persist, their questions echo across 3,000 years. Tonight, you spoke the name Ammit, and in speaking it, you performed an act that ancient Egyptians would have recognized as magical. You made her exist again, if only for a moment, in your mind and in mine. You brought Anubis into being by thinking of him. You walked through the Duat simply by imagining it. The Egyptian concept of the Ren held that speaking a name kept its owner alive. As long as someone remembered you, as long as your name was spoken, you continued to exist in some real sense. By that measure, by their own criteria for immortality, the ancient Egyptians achieved exactly what they sought. They live on in our memories, in our retellings, in nights like this when we map their underworld and speak their names and walk their path through death toward paradise. They prepared so meticulously for an afterlife that may not exist. They spent fortunes on tombs and texts and mummification. They devoted their entire civilization to answering questions about death that have no certain answers. And in doing so, in taking death seriously enough to map it, to name its demons, to chart its geography, to develop elaborate systems of judgment and reward, they created something more lasting than any individual eternal life. They created a system of meaning, a framework for thinking about mortality, morality, justice, and the human need to believe that death is not annihilation, but transformation. Whether the Duat exists as they envisioned it is almost beside the point. What matters is that they refused to accept death as meaningless, refused to surrender to the terror of non-existence without fighting back with every tool at their disposal: ritual, magic, art, architecture, and above all, story. This script you've just experienced, this journey through their afterlife, is itself a kind of resurrection. For the past hour, the ancient Egyptian worldview has lived again. The Duat has existed again. The weighing of the heart has happened again, not on golden scales in a hall of judgment, but in your imagination, which is perhaps the only immortality any of us will ever truly access. So perhaps the priests didn't lie after all. Perhaps they understood something deeper than literal truth. Perhaps they knew that immortality wasn't about your individual consciousness continuing forever, but about your essence, your story, your values, your questions, your answers, being woven into the great human narrative so thoroughly that they could never be fully extracted, never be completely forgotten. Your name, ancient Egyptian, we speak tonight. Your journey we have traced. Your hope for eternity we have honored by remembering it, by telling it, by walking with you through the Duat and celebrating your arrival in the field of reeds. In this speaking, in this remembering, you live, if not in the way you expected, then perhaps in a way that's even more wonderful, because it's real. It's happening right now, in this moment, as these words activate the only magic that ever truly worked. The magic of story, of memory, of one consciousness reaching across impossible spans of time to touch another and say, I see you, I remember you. You existed, and that existence meant something, and I will not let you be forgotten. May you live forever, Blessed One. May your heart be light. May your name be remembered. May you dwell eternally in paradise, in the presence of Osiris, in the company of all the justified dead, in the field of reeds where the harvest never fails, and the sun always shines, and love never ends. The journey through the Duat is complete. The weighing is past. Paradise is reached, and the ancient Egyptian afterlife, that intricate system of belief and practice that shaped one of history's greatest civilizations, has been revealed in all its complex, beautiful, terrifying, hopeful detail. Sleep well, traveler, and if you dream, dream of Egypt, of the Nile flowing eternally, of fields of golden grain, of loved ones reunited, of hearts lighter than feathers, of a paradise that lasts forever. The sun has risen. The journey is done, and the ancient Egyptian, justified and blessed, dwells eternally in the field of reeds exactly as they hoped, exactly as they believed, exactly as they prepared for throughout their entire life. Ma'at is satisfied. Balance is restored. Truth has been weighed and found worthy. And somewhere in the eternal present of the afterlife, in the perfected Egypt that never fades, the blessed dead are waking to another perfect day in paradise. Thank you for joining this journey through the Egyptian afterlife. May your own path, whatever form it takes, be filled with light, truth, and the presence of those you love. Good night.